Hi, and welcome back to It's Not History, the podcast where the past is never dead. It's not even past. Episode 10, the First World War. So, the First World War, as most of us know, started when a nobody named Gavril Princip assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg dynasty, in a border town named Sarajevo. This minor incident, not for the Archduke certainly, somehow within months triggered a conflict that was unprecedented in scope, its violence, and its impact on the nations involved. Countless died, empires crumbled. Except it wasn't unprecedented. It had all happened before. And the first time Europeans' armies locked in a long struggle that decimated a generation and stretched across the globe, it didn't start in the Balkans. It started in the backwoods of Pennsylvania. And the insignificant man was not a Serbian nationalist, but a 21-year-old Virginia Plantation owner. One who would, given his ignoble start in life, thankfully for him, be remembered for more noble endeavors later in his life. So if you remember back to our Bacon's Rebellion episode, most plantation owners in Virginia grew a greedy crop, tobacco. Greedy because tobacco rapidly depleted the nutrients in the soil, and in a time before commercial fertilizers, this meant that they needed to get ever more new land to grow on. And because harvesting and drying tobacco was hard, heavy work, all this new land demanded new labor. And most plantation owners were, by 1750, heavily in debt to creditors, while heavily exposed to fluctuating commodity prices for tobacco. They needed a way out, and that way out was west. The plantation owners had first tried to solve the labor problem with indentured English, but that first wave was quickly exhausted when most of them died out or fled. They then turned to indentured or enslaved Native Americans, which was a racket that Nathaniel Bacon's nemesis, Governor Barclay, had a near monopoly on. And then when this was outlawed after the collapse of Bacon's uprising, they then relied on the importation of enslaved Africans. But the land part couldn't be solved with just money or human bondage, because by the mid-1700s, all the arable land east of the mountains was claimed. But west of the Appalachian Mountains was a whole continent. So salvation for land-hungry settlers in Virginia beckoned in the west, in the broad valley of the Ohio River, fertile and uninhabited, except, of course, for the indigenous nations of the Shawnee, Algonquin, Lenape, and others. But inhabited, of course, from the Virginians' perspective, meant inhabited by Englishmen with deed and title, which didn't exist in Ohio. What did exist was a network of French settlements, mostly traders, who, traveling up the Mississippi and down from the Great Lakes, had been there for as long as the English had been in the East. The French, for their part, generally had good relations with the Indians in the region because they were there largely as fur traders and made few claims on the land. Their influence was spread thinly and broadly across the central part of the continent, and from there up north into New France with its capital in Quebec. English settlement, meanwhile, had largely been halted just west of Lancaster, where the foothills of the Allegheny meet the Susquehanna River. These mountains were a permeable membrane to traders, but for settlers, it was a wall. A wall maintained under law by the Penn family, who banned settlement on land that they hadn't purchased directly from the native inhabitants. So this effectively dammed up the colonists behind it, and it was a dam that Virginia's planters hoped to breach. So they, Virginia's elite, petitioned the crown for help and received a royal commission from King George II for 500,000 acres in the valley of the Ohio River. And so the Virginia Company of Ohio was formed and funded by investments from a Virginia plantation class hoping to become the new Ohio plantation class. The only problem with this, of course, was that territory was also claimed by Pennsylvania, which was a problem, and occupied by France, which was a really big problem, because, well, the French saw their relations with the Indians as generally good and stable. The same wasn't true of their relationship with the English. Because from the time of the French conquest of England in 1066, this had been a relationship that was, in the best of times, contentious, and in the worst of times, fratricidal. And this was not the best of times. Catholic France meddled in English politics in any way they could. For example, they supported an invasion of England from Scotland, when the last claimant to the Stuart throne, full disclosure, named Charles Stuart, resulted in the disastrous, for Scotland, Battle of Culloden in 1746. The Protestant English, for their part, happily led Protestant forces against the French across Europe in the War of Spanish Succession, resulting in the disastrous, for the French, Battle of Blenheim in 1701, led by the English general John Churchill, by the way, great-grandfather of Winston, and then the War of Austrian Succession, which had just wound down in 1749. And as I mentioned briefly in the last episode, the medal presented to Coquesque by Charles II had as his title, King of England, Scotland, Ireland, and France. Because the English crown, for some reason, still claimed that some or all of France belonged to it, England. So any place there was a border between France and England, there was potential for something very, very bad to happen. And Western Pennsylvania, in the middle of the 1700s, was exactly that. A rough, ill-defined territory that was now owned, in air quotes, by two European empires and actually occupied by half a dozen indigenous ones. And in the proof of the adage that fools rush in where angels fear to tread, in May of 1754, our 21-year-old Virginian blindly charged into this roomful of gunpowder with a lit match, when he led a detachment of the English Virginia militia into the French-held land in the Ohio Valley. He was accompanied by members of the Mingo tribe and their leader, Tanagrishan. Tanagrishan, for his part, hated the French for reasons both political and personal. Political because unchallenged French incursion into his territory had undermined his authority, and personal because he, Tanagrishan, thought they, the French, had eaten his father. And the Virginian's name, by the way, was Colonel George Washington. Yeah, that George Washington. He had, at the time, no military experience and little experience dealing with Indians. What could go wrong? As it turns out, everything. Horace Walpole, the English diarist and contemporary of Washington, described what happened next as, quote, the volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America that set the world on fire. Washington's marching orders were simple. Make contact with a group of English in the Ohio Valley, help them build a fort, maybe ascertain the French intentions, then report back. Nowhere does it say, ambush a French diplomatic mission and then, after they surrender, kill all of them. One of whom, by the way, is for extra measure a member of French nobility and whose brother is the commander of the French army in the Ohio Valley and is stationed in the fort just down the road. Not what he was supposed to do, but that's, of course, exactly what happened. Somehow Washington's forces made contact with a small column of lightly armed French headed east on a diplomatic mission to open talks with the British. Just the sort of discussion that Washington's superiors probably hoped he would have. Figure out what the French are up to, tell them to leave, walk away. No. Instead, in this tense situation led by a very nervous and inexperienced young man, someone fires a shot, others panic, and soon all the French lay dead. Some of the blame for who instigated the attacks and executions can probably be laid on the Mingos and Tanagrishan. But if this was the case, it probably had more to do with Washington's lack of experience and inability to recognize the fact that Tanagrishan and his men were there to pursue strategies that were in the best interest of their community, not Washington's. Regardless, he was in charge, and when weeks later the French forces, led by the brother of the dead French diplomat, tracked down Washington's forces and overran them at a place called Fort Necessity, east of present-day Pittsburgh, as one of the terms of his surrender, he was forced to sign a document taking responsibility for the whole debacle, including the murder of the prisoners. Then, amazingly, they set him free, back to Virginia, bloodied, defeated, and humiliated. Given what happened next, he was one of the lucky ones. Because the French took his signed confession back to France, evidence of British hostile intent and duplicity, and it became the match that lit the fuse that set off the largest, most widespread conflict the world had seen to that point and would see for another 180 years until the next First World War started in 1914. This war would ignite in the backwoods of Pennsylvania and spread from there to the Caribbean, then to battlefields across Europe, and eventually all the way to the coast of India. Not only would just about every major European power get sucked into its vortex, even the Mughal Empire in India and the Iroquois Confederacy in North America would become involved. It eventually became known as the 7 Years' War, and in the American theater of conflict, it was called the French and Indian War. It was, however, the First World War. But from the vantage point of people living in the Susquehanna Valley at the time, this wasn't a world war, or a 7 Years' War, or even the French and Indian War. Those labels would come later. Here, in the new frontier of Pennsylvania, became a new front line, where senseless, bloody violence was up close and personal. So campaigns would be waged and battles fought, forts conquered and liberated. The labels Braddock's defeat and Battle for Ontario masked the grim existence that was the new reality for the people of Pennsylvania, the starting point of the conflict and its fulcrum for much of it in North America. It's worth thinking about for a minute what this must have been like, because it's the experience of these people at this time in this place that shapes much of what happens in America from then until now. Because first, this was a war fought here, not there. Unlike the next world wars fought almost exclusively over there, American soldiers in this war didn't have to go to the front line. It came to them. Also, it lasted a long, long time. The American Civil War, the other great conflict on American soil, would last just 4 years. The French and Indian War and its reverberations lasted twice as long. An entire generation came of age on the new frontier under the shadow of incessant violence. And lastly, this is what we'd call today a guerrilla war. Well, in this war, like most wars, a lot of ink gets spilled describing the exploits of men in uniform, armies clashing in ways that uniformed armies do, generals in battlefields, campaign strategy and tactics. But from the point of view of ordinary Pennsylvanians, either native or settler, violence could come from any direction at any time, and rarely, if ever, did the enemy wear a uniform. As Patrick Sparrow puts it in Frontier Country, The Politics of War in Eastern Pennsylvania, quote, "If there was one defining feature of the war in the region, it was the overwhelming Indian on white violence. Such an experience was different from other places in North America. In the Northern Theater around New York and Canada, the French and British armies fought traditional battles aimed at strategic posts and cities, with native allies joining them. But in the Ohio, the French, who were pressed for men, relied on Indians to wage their offensive, and colonial communities filled with civilians became their chief targets. Thus, for most colonists in Pennsylvania, this war was an invasive Indian war as much as it was a battle between European sovereigns for control of the interior." He continues, "Experiencing war firsthand was a transformative experience for a large segment of the colonial population. It's likely that at least 33% of the total colonial population lived in this war zone. Moreover, the war itself extracted a heavy toll. Approximately 1% of the colonial population was captured, and the per capita death toll in the colony mirrored that of Pennsylvanians killed in the American Civil War. The Susquehanna Valley was a frontier war zone, and as one survivor put it, it was a 30-mile wide and 300-mile long wasteland. For the inhabitants, the peaceable kingdom it was only a generation before must have seemed like a barely recalled dream, compared to the unimaginable terror and trauma that was now their existence. As Patrick Sparrow writes, those who survived suffered lasting psychological scars. One woman who did survive was Rona Barber, who wrote a memoir of her life as a young woman living in Lancaster at the time. She writes, "In the fall of the year 1755, the inhabitants of this place was alarmed for their situation on account of the Indians. Braddock's army had been defeated and dispersed the preceding summer. The soldiers had gone to winter quarters, and the whole frontier lay open. It was reported that the Indians were preparing a large number of bark canoes at the head of the Susquehanna, and were coming in a great body to destroy all before them. I heard my mother describe the dreadful way we were in, alarmed at the slightest noise in the night, expecting every hour to see the canoes coming down upon us. This was their lived experience, and in it the roots of what would soon happen in Conestoga town in 1763 and 1764. Because here, distinctions begin to matter, really matter. And one of the most distinct groups were the Presbyterian Scots-Irish. They had arrived late to the party and were seated at the margins of the settler borderland, physically, socially occupying the margins of the colony in Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna in Lancaster County. The violence of the war came at them from the west, over the mountains, and without warning.
Now, when the French and the English go to war, the Delaware Indians and the Shawnee Indians, using the terminology of the time, join that conflict on the French side.
Kevin Kenny is a professor of history at New York University and author of Peaceable Kingdom Lost.
And they begin to launch raids into eastern Pennsylvania, the eastern side of the river. And the first line of defense for Pennsylvania are these Scots-Irish settlers who have settled on that land over the previous generation. This is in a context where Pennsylvania is still a peaceable kingdom in the sense that it does not have its own army. It does not have its own militia. And so we arrive at a situation where the Scots-Irish in this buffer zone find themselves defending Pennsylvania against attack from previously displaced Native American populations.
They found themselves, their families, and communities on the front line in the hilly country that borders the Susquehanna, where they are suddenly the first, last, and only line of defense. And to their dismay, they get little to no support from the leaders in Philadelphia.
And so the Penn family had relied on powerful Native American brokers, in particular the Iroquois Confederacy, to negotiate relations with Native American nations like the Delaware and the Shawnee, who in a sense were answerable to the Iroquois as overlords. That all breaks down. And at the beginning of the war, Pennsylvania does not have its own fighting force. And so the Scots-Irish in the Susquehanna River region are quite upset that they are both on the receiving end of the violence that's coming at them, and that they are somehow expected to defend Pennsylvania at a time when they are quite disaffected from its governing elites.
Fear and anger grows in the backcountry. Fear of the incessant, unpredictable attacks by the French and their native allies, and anger against, as they see it, a feckless Quaker ruling class that has seemingly left them to bleed on the frontier, while they, the ruling class, are free to do politics in the coffee houses of Philadelphia. Only 100 miles, but a world away. From the perspective of the indigenous continent, this was a time of purpose and opportunity. James Smith, a Pennsylvanian captured and adopted by Indians, asked a native leader about the objective of a raid he was about to launch into Virginia. The response by the leader was simple and straightforward. Drive all the Virginians back across the lake being the Atlantic Ocean. And for one tribe, the Lenape, pushed west after their homeland in Pennsylvania had been stolen from them during the infamous Walking Purchase, what had been taken through duplicity, they would now try to reclaim with unrestrained violence.
This is important because the largest group of Native Americans in that part of the country, all the way up to New York, were the Delaware or Lenni Lenape Indians. Their land is seized. They move west. They move to the other side of the Susquehanna River. Now, when the French and the English go to war, the Delaware Indians join that conflict on the French side, and they begin to launch raids into eastern Pennsylvania.
The English crown, for its part, was not about to let this happen, so they sent a real soldier to replace Colonel Washington and show him how it's done. General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia with 1,500 regular British troops and soon marched west toward the Ohio Valley with George Washington as his aide. In July 1755, his army crossed the Monongahela River and, emerging wet and exhausted, found a French and Native American force waiting for them. 2/3 of Braddock's army was killed or wounded. Among the dead was Braddock himself. Not among them was the very, very lucky George Washington. Somehow, in the span of a year, Washington had led 2 contingents of British soldiers to 2 of the greatest defeats in the history of the British Army, and in both cases, walked away to fight another day. The further irony, of course, is that the next time Washington would put on a uniform, as the man the Continental Congress would put at the top of the list to head the new army, it would be to fight the British with the French as his allies. One thing that would not change when he changed uniforms was his perception that Native Americans were largely enemies of the European Americans and obstacles to a new nation conceived in liberty and headed west. A belief that, as we'll see in coming episodes, was a family inheritance.
So join us next time on It's Not History, when we look at the first American Revolution. Not the one that Washington leads in 1776, but the one in the most important year in American history that you've probably never heard of, 1763. I'd like to thank my guest, Kevin Kenny. You can find a link to his book, Peaceable Kingdom, as well as all the other great and influential works he's authored in the show notes at itsnothistory.com. Thanks for listening.